and welcome to She the People's Women's Writers Fest. This panel is about diversity in children's writing. In the last 8 months, we have witnessed a lot of things one would have never imagined. The pandemic has affected our lives in more ways than one. The idea of democracy is in a flux. We have been hearing about brutal assaults on young girls, domestic violence has gone up, and children are observing these changes, and in some cases, witnessing and facing them too. As adults, we are constantly wondering what kind of world we are handing down to our children. In this panel, we look at what is influencing what children are reading, who decides what they should be reading, the diversity that is available in writing for children in India, and talk to some amazing women authors who are doing some path-breaking work in children's and young adult literature. We have with us on this panel author and conservationist Zai Whitaker, who is the managing trustee of Madras Crocodile Bank Trust Center for Herpetology. She's also a teacher and written dozens of books for young readers and children. Unfortunately, at the Croc Bank, the internet is a bit temperamental. Hence, we decided to record her sessions with us. Paro Anand. For the past 35 years, Paro Anand has dedicated her life to creating and promoting literature for youth and reading habit. She has been honored with the Sahitya Akademi Bal Sahitya Puraskar 2017. She has also developed Literature in Action, a program through which she has interacted with over 3 lakh children. She has published 25 books, including novels, short stories, collections, plays, and an activity based teacher's guide. We welcome you, Paro. Dr. Devika Rangachari is an award winning writer. Devika has also completed her postdoctoral research on gender in Indian history. She is currently the recipient of prestigious National Fellowship awarded by the Ministry of Culture in India to research aspects of gender and historical fiction in Indian children's literature. We begin our journey, our panel discussion today with Devika. Devika, to you, uh, I would like to ask, you are a gender historian and you write about women in history. How did you start writing for young adults? Did you plan on becoming a children's writer?
Um, Thanks, Deepshikha. It's if I could answer that question in a reverse sequence, how did I decide to become a children's writer? I think it's a consequence of my reading voraciously all through my growing up years and even now, in fact. So if you read a lot, I think you're already halfway into becoming a writer. So um, why did I decide to write for young adults? Well, the fact is that as a gender historian, you realize that women are basically written out of history, made invisible or made to seem irrelevant to the past narrative of the past because of the male-centered bias that goes into its writing. And I knew that that students don't have access to this sort of material in their textbooks, which again are completely male centered. And normally the textbooks will just have a little token paragraph on how what women wore in the past, their jewelry and their clothes, and actually focus on the men who went out and fought battles and founded kingdoms and did the real things that mattered, while women sat around supposedly obsessing over what to wear. Now, as a gender historian, and you look at the original sources like inscriptions, texts, and coins and so on, you realize that the picture is completely different. That women actually had a huge role to play in all phases of the past. And so I decided to write about some of these remarkable women who had been written out of history and who I uncovered in the course of my doctoral and postdoctoral research. I decided to write about them for young adults so that they had access to some information on their collective past that they had a right to know about. So this is how I think I've written for all. I've written for all ages of children. I've written picture books. I've written for junior readers, middle grade, and then I think now I found my niche in writing historical fiction for young adults.
Sorry, Deepshikha, I couldn't hear the question because you were on mute.
Sorry,
But
I'm sorry. I'm sorry about this.
yeah,
Yeah. So, Paro, my question to you is one of the biggest challenges of writing for children or young adults is that they are often not the buyers of the books. You have to cross the gatekeepers, and should adults like the parents or the librarians have this authority to stand between a child and his curiosity? Because often what appeals to a child's mind is not won't appeal to an adult's logic.
I think it's in a way a tricky question because as a parent, uh, don't I have the right to curate what my child has access to? But I grew up in a open shelf household. We could pull books off any shelf and book, and we could read it. And if we didn't understand it, then either we'd ask or we'd drop the book because we didn't understand it and try something else. And so I read, I mean, the start of my reading was completely unfettered by what is now become such a trend of cutting children up into small pieces of age group, where we have actually, all these weird uh, categories of tweens and pre-tweens and young adult and all of that, and what does it mean? And one size has never fitted all. So why do we do this? I understand for a publisher pitching it. Now there are awards which you need to have it. So it's tricky. But I think that if there is a child who's wanting to read a particular book, then he shouldn't be stopped from reading it. My son was a until he discovered some Asimov. He was in class four. But when he went to his school to borrow more Asimov, he was told couldn't because he was too young. He was enjoying it at home. So should you have the right to curate what your children are reading? I don't know exactly. I think though we need to have greater trust. That,
Thank you, Paro, for that answer. And now we will have a look at what we asked Zai. But the children today are buying more books and reading less. So here is what Zai had to tell us.
It's very difficult to say because we keep talking about these issues in terms of the sort of English speaking city living group of people. But looking at it in the wider context, my wish is that publishers would become more committed to translations and distribution in other languages. I feel this really has to happen at a much more vigorous level than it is now, because the English-speaking city kids have the choice. Most of them have the means, to buy collections of books from India and abroad. But it's the other kids who don't have access to English, who we really need to think of much more seriously and in a much more committed way as writers and publishers.
So next, we would like to talk about the themes that children's book would have. And I'll come to you, Paro, asking you, how do you decide where you should draw the line when you're talking about something? How much is too much when it comes to young adult literature, when in fact everything is available to them at a click on the internet?
yeah, that's a great question because I don't think anything is too much. And I've not come to the conclusion because as a writer, I think, oh, I'll push this boundary and oh, I'll break down this wall. No, it comes directly from children. As you mentioned in my intro, I've worked with over 3 lakh children, and I think during the pandemic, that number has shot up hugely. So at the end, I always ask children, what kind of themes do you want to write on? Or what kind of themes do you think should feature in books for you? Um, the kind of answers that come tell you that there shouldn't be any taboos. I have written personally about transgender, about coming out stories, about rape and sexual assault, about domestic violence, about death of a parent. And because I terrorism and migration and displacement, but not because I thought, hey, how cool it'll be. There's no other book like this. I'll write one. No, it's because that was the kind of feedback that has come to me from children directly. And I want to just share one really interesting recent incident where I was in a small town in Haryana, an all girls school. And when I asked the question, what do you want, written about, what do you want me to write on next? And this one girl said, Aapne Veere the wedding dekhi hai? So I said, yes, I've seen Veere the wedding. She said, aapko pata hai main kis scene ke baare mein pooch rahi hu? And I said, I can guess what it is. And she said, aap uske baare mein kyun nahi likhte ho? The scene she was talking about, of course, is the much controversial scene of the self gratification of masturbation. And here was this young little girl from a small town in Haryana asking me to write a book on masturbation and sexual pleasure. Could I write it? Maybe. Would it get published? Unlikely. Would it ever get into school? Never. So, sort of tying in with the first question about gatekeepers, should uh, should we should we continue to be ostriches with our head in the sand and pretend they don't know about it? They're not talking about it. They are talking about it. Kids are talking about every single issue. The only thing is they're not talking with us. So how do we take that leap? I think is by I found bringing up my own children, reading the same books as they're reading, talking about it, and I think they get a better sense, a better understanding, a better sensitivity to a sensitive. When I told a story about domestic violence and a child asked a true story, I said, "What do you think?" And she said, "It's definitely a true story." I said, "How do you say with such confidence?" And she said, "Because it's happening in my house." And obviously, if you were to ask a classroom of children, is there domestic violence in your house? None of them would say. But once this girl spoke up, others also talked about the witness to and aware of domestic violence and all the things that they felt. And also, most of all, that they felt helpless. So then we talked about what could be a strategy for them to bring an end to that domestic violence and just that awareness.
Thank you, Paro. So, on this note, we will go again to Zai and ask. Zai had written a book on Salim, Mamu, and Me, where she talks about a troubled girl with a superstar uncle, and she talks about this issue of having a super achiever in the family. And I think it's an issue with a lot of kids that they would feel that they have this pressure to perform. So here's what Zai has to tell us about her relationship with her famous uncle, Salim Ali.
He was definitely a very exciting element in our family, no doubt about it. And one of my regrets is that I didn't listen to him more carefully, didn't spend more time with him. Quite often, well, 2 or 3 times when there was an opportunity to go out into the field with him, I would say, oh no, I've got a friends thing. I need to do something else. And I wish I had, because apart from being an amazing naturalist and scientist, he was also a very inspiring person. And now, after all these decades, I find myself thinking more and more about what I should now learn from him. And one of those things is his discipline. He was a very disciplined person, a very disciplined field person, as well as in his office. And I just wish I had a few more of his qualities. But yes, lots of wonderful times growing up.
Thank you. So, Devika, will come to you now. You have written books of history where you talk about women in history. So, talk to us about writing violence and retelling of history for young readers.
So violence, as Paro has just said, is more or less a fact of life. It has always been a fact of life. I mean, there's violence outside, there's violence within the home. It can be perpetrated in different ways. But the fact is that there are a lot of people who would, and particularly the gatekeepers who we were just discussing, the adults who come between the child and the book, would like to believe that the past was a very pristine, peaceful, happy place where nothing, vicious or violent ever happened. And by doing that, they feel that the child should not be reading about violence in the past. Now, you can't, if you're writing an objective history, an accurate history, you cannot leave out the violent bits. I mean, this is a fact of life. And if you think that a child is going to get mentally unhinged or extremely disturbed by just reading about violence that happened in the past, then you are grossly underestimating the intelligence and discernment of the child. A child reads because he or she has the ability to take what they want from a particular book. You can't make assumptions on their behalf. So, I actually feel very strongly about this, that the adults are sometimes the biggest obstacles in a child's reading journey. So regarding violence, that I had to incorporate violence in both my books, Queen of Ice and Queen of Earth, that talked about Kashmir and Orissa respectively. I had the fortune of having these wonderful publishers, Duckbill, where I was told that you go ahead and you write exactly what you want to write, as bloody as you want it to be, and it's our job to market it and make it acceptable. And they actually did that. Although I have personally had problems in certain school libraries where the librarian has sort of just flipped through the book and said, "Oh, she's this queen is cutting off people's heads." And these 14-year-olds and 15-year-olds are going to be very upset if they read about it. And of course, your first reaction is to be highly sarcastic, try and shake some sense into them, but then you can't always do that. So you have to find a very diplomatic way to kind of explain to them that, let the child read and understand what we're trying to say as authors. And this is history, you cannot whitewash it. And yes, of course, the queens I've chosen to write on, particularly, this Queen of Ice, this book, is quite ruthless. But she's also an extremely remarkable woman who did a lot of things for early medieval Kashmir. So I cannot just write one part of her story and then leave out the other. So I have lost that fear. Initially, I had those inhibitions about how much violence, where do I draw the line? Is there a line to be drawn? Now I think I'm letting go of that fear and just writing in an uninhibited manner about violence, and just trusting that the people that I write for are able to appreciate what I'm trying to convey to them.
Thank you. So here next we'll move on to your latest books, and we'll take a comment from Zai, who has written a book on Cyrus the virus. All of us are facing. Here's what Zai has to say about Cyrus the virus.
When the lockdown started, I think I wanted to start writing something. The Croc Bank was closed. We had no visitors. This is where I'm living and working now. So I thought I would start another writing project. And I wanted to write an adventure story, and was sort of mentally flaying about, wondering what what the plan and the plot could be. And then one day it suddenly hit me that the biggest adventure of all time is happening right around you and all around the world. So let's write about that. Initially, the adventure story was supposed to be a messageless story, but because it became Xyrus the virus, of course, the message is very strong and clear, and that seems to happen to everything I write, that I set out to write a story, and somewhere along the way a message gets hold of me and it becomes a story with a message. So that's what happened to Xyrus.
So I'll come to Paro now. Paro, like violence, death are part of your book. Your recent book talked about Kashmir, tribal children leaving behind your homeland, which are all difficult topics. You have never believed in painting a rose-tinted world for children. Tell us a bit about your journey with Nomad Land.
Thank you. So this is my newest baby, number 34 or something like that. I don't quite know. But yeah, sorry, this way. Nomad's Land. And it's a story of displacement. And I wanted to write a story about the Kashmiri Pandit story, because that hasn't really been handled by for young people. But then I wanted to write a story on a bigger story, a wider story. When I started writing it, I was thinking of one particular displaced community. But as the pandemic and then the migration, this mass migration thing was happening, and there were also, just before that, those images of children on the beach with those boats which came with fleeing refugees. And I thought, no, this is a bigger story, and I do want to tell the Kashmiri Pandit story. But the second story, I want it to be much wider. I want it to be uh, compassing. And so I made up a tribe which I've pulled threads from various different communities. I've made up a tribe, made up their culture, their clothes, and even their language, which was very exciting to do. I really talked about placement and the cutting of roots does, especially the violent cutting of roots. And just to go back to what Devika was saying about violence, when I wrote No Guns at My Son's Funeral, it was one of the first ones that talked about something as serious as terrorism for a young audience. But it was a very popular book, and it was put onto the CBSE recommended reading list and everything. When the book came, this is the one which won the Sahitya Academy Award for Children's Literature. But this book became banned in some schools. And as I tried to figure out what was the reason for it to be banned, there are stories as themes such as sexual assault and so many other subjects. And what was the reason for it to be banned? It wasn't the violence that alarmed the gatekeepers. It was the love. It was a boy and a girl, one Muslim, one Hindu, God forbid, who share a brief kiss because they come from these communities who are being brought up to be suspicious of each other. And to take that leap, they have this one brief kiss. And children have said, because I mean they go out together as a couple for a while, but then they break up, go their own ways. Children always say, why didn't you let them get married? And in some schools have had the book banned. So there's this.
Yeah. So that takes me to Devika. So again, Devika, your works talk about women of history who have been made invisible. The Queen of Ice focuses on Queen Didda of Kashmir, and Queen of Earth, your recent work talks about Prithvi Mahadevi, who ruled Orissa in 9th century. Both of these women were breaking stereotypes and trying to make women's role in history relevant. Talk a bit about the initial feedback you got when you said that you would be writing these books, and what did the naysayers tell you?
Okay, so Queen of Ice, as you said, is about Didda, who ruled Kashmir in the 10th century AD for around 50 years, 50. But you will only ever hear about the men who ruled before or after her, maybe even just for a couple of years, because men are just seen as more important in the historical narrative than women. So when you read about Didda in other sources, you'll probably find her being either made invisible, so she's not mentioned at all, or she's criticized for being a woman who actually wanted to rule and who therefore was not really a woman as much as a man, because she was ruthless, she was ambitious, and she was very intelligent. So all this contravenes the stereotype of a gentle, domesticized woman who should just sit at home and obsess over what to wear. As I said, she was also lame, she couldn't walk, and she needed somebody to carry her around. And despite all this, she ruled Kashmir with a very firm hand. Prithvi Mahadevi of Queen of Earth is another remarkable woman who's been, in fact, almost completely wiped out in the annals of history, because you either won't hear about her in accounts of early medieval Orissa, she ruled in the 9th century, or you will be told that by her rule, she brought about the downfall of the dynasty that she was a part of, because a woman ruling a dynasty spells disaster. Now the problem is that I don't think that both these women saw themselves as, being like breaking stereotypes or so on in their time. It's just that we are looking from a modern angle and then putting them into that role. The fact is, both of them had to deal with a patriarchal structure and a certain circumscribed sort of existence. And they were both able very successfully to push the boundaries and sort of challenge a lot of strictures that were handed out to them to sort of actualize their potential. Naysayers, they are always naysayers when you write about women and when you write about history. So put them together, and it's a lethal combination. But as I said earlier, my wonderful publishers just said, "Yeah, we want such women to be written about. So just write about them. Don't worry about it." And I have come across a range of receptions to these books. The children, the young adults who are the target audience for these books, love them, and they want to know, why history can't be taught in this way, and why is it that they're never told about these women, and why is it that when I'm saying that the sources are saying this, then why are historians actually ignoring those sources and telling us a completely lopsided picture? And then, of course, it goes back to why don't they know more about women in history? Why do they only know token names like, Noor Jahan, Razia Sultan, but they don't know much else? Um, and there have also been a lot of questions about both these women are very inspiring in different ways. Strong women who thought about how much they could achieve, didn't have any scruples about setting out to fulfill what they wanted to. So in a way, both the stories are quite inspiring, and it has been seen like that. But I have also come across views on the other end of the spectrum where I have been told, oh, so you're writing about women in history, how does that contribute to anyone's understanding of history? Or okay, but should you be writing about these women? I mean, you should sort of. There were other things to them as well. It was not as if they were violent. Again, we go back to the violence. It's not as if they were that violent. We shouldn't portray them as this, because then they become wrong role models for children. And I just want to tell them that because I read a story about a thief as a child doesn't mean I go out the next day and rob a bank. So that's what I'm saying. I mean, my young adult readers, I am completely convinced that they are all intelligent. They are all, capable of reading these books without getting disturbed or upset about this. And I think it's high time that the adults just moved out of the way and allowed such books to be written, because it's important to give women a voice particularly women from history, who are just completely not known, because this has an impact on the way you treat women in the present situation as well. If you don't have respect and acknowledgement of the women in the past, how are you going to provide the same respect and acknowledgement in the present? So I don't listen to naysayers anymore. I couldn't care less about them. And and if I'm able to convert a single naysayer into a follower of my books through what I write, then I would consider myself successful.
So I'll quickly go to you only for my next question, which is like, have you ever faced gender-based bias for being a woman author or a children's book writer?
Not for being a women's writer. I think we all know in India, I mean, particularly those who write in English, which is a small group, it's basically women.
Yeah.
There are very few male authors, but there is a ridiculous bias that I think all of us face as writers for just writing for children, because it is assumed that you are just marking time until you can graduate into the real writing, which is the writing for adults, which is the thing that wins
Yeah.
you the Booker prizes and the recognition and so on. So with children's writing, it's like, why are you doing this? Why are you wasting your time? It's okay, we should just sit down and write something serious, write something sensible. So that kind of bias can be infuriating, but it's ubiquitous. You can't fight it. And I think children's authors everywhere are a very resilient breed, but a much maligned breed too. So it's nice that we can sort of band together and discuss these problems, and just have some kind of comfort in knowing that we face this together.
Yeah. So Paro, your comments on that?
Well, I'll tell you, it's true that there are more women writers who write for children. And someone asked me, is it because women understand children much better? And I said, no, I think it's because children's writing doesn't pay much. And so, yeah, as a wife, maybe I have somebody to fall back on, or maybe, something like that. It's the economics of the situation, not so much, I think, for children. But jokes aside, how often people used to say, when I said that I write for children, people would say, "What a nice hobby," and it used to infuriate me because I said, "It's not a hobby; it's my profession, it's my career." But I think that has changed somewhat. It's not so much being a woman writer as writing for children. Completely agree with everything that Devika said. But I think that a book like Nomad's Land, where I don't know, book sort of goes off into some corner. A book like Nomad's Land, which is about girls and about taking initiative, going on this quest to redefine and reset down roots. I think we as women need to play a very important part in the positive representation of women in our stories. And then it won't matter. Then I mean, I hope the day comes soon when we can just be called writers and not women's writers and children's writers and just writers.
So here's where we'll take a comment from Zai, because her experience is slightly different. So this is what Zai has to say about facing bias as a writer for children's book.
I would like to say yes, because that would be the politically correct thing to say. But I haven't really, except for one workshop that I went to, a writing workshop, and all the men writers went off to have a good time in the evening, and they didn't invite us two women writers to join them. In natural history, I think the only person who looks down on myself is myself, because, I'm always feeling that other people, and most of them are men, know so much more and can do so much more than I can, especially when we're in the field. So, no, I don't think so.
So I'll take a closing comments quickly on the diversity that is available in children's writing today, and if you think that there is more that needs to be done. Paro, can I have your comments first?
there's huge diversity and huge inclusivity being seen in children's books right now. My book called The Other, this one, is very sharply on how we otherize people. And the kind of response that I've got from schools and children it has been phenomenal. So I think diversity is definitely growing. Does more? Sure, for sure. I think for myself, I need more. Am I advising? No, I don't think so. I think if um, I don't know if I'm making this buzzing noise or not, but sorry, but I think that we need to not think of uh, what we need to write and what we don't need to write. We can write about everything. My only personal in thinking about diverse subjects is that I don't want to leave my young readers in facing a sense of hopelessness. The teenage years, the young adult years are a dark time. And I want to leave my book feeling that there is light at the end of the tunnel. It doesn't matter how dark that tunnel is, there is a light because I think it would be dangerous to paint it completely black.
Devika, can we have your comments on this?
Yeah, I mean, as Paro says, we've come a very long way from when, most of the stories that were published had to sort of adhere to a traditional format. You couldn't write about dysfunctional families and so on because that was seen as not really fitting in with the Indian tradition and so on and so forth. So now there's a welcome range of books that you could read on a variety of subjects. But the only word of caution that I would like to say is yes, you could write about, I mean, you can't, it shouldn't be like an agenda, like today I'm going to write a book about somebody who's suffering domestic violence and you just write about it. Because just giving visibility to something doesn't mean you're accurately representing it. So your research is vital. You can't just write, in a vacuum. You have to really have some grounding in what you want to write on, whether it's history, whether it's, domestic violence, whether it's, I know, disability, homosexuality, whatever it is. You need to make sure that you are accurately representing what you're setting out to represent rather than just saying, oh, I featured this character there who's, who's got all these issues and therefore I have done my bit. And it's just on the surface, it's a very shallow rendition. So I think we need to be a little careful about that as well. But having said that, I think there's a sea change in the kind of diversity that is there in children's literature today in India.
We'll also take the comments from Zai here. This is what Zai has to say about the diversity in children's literature today.
I think it's a fantastic range, and it's just, every few months I sort of Google, children's books, and it's just amazing, I think, what a resource it's becoming. And especially for somebody my age, I mean, I grew up at a time when Enid Blyton and Robin Hood were practically, the sum total of our library, and then the little children's book trust books that we used to treasure. So I think it's amazing. I think the children of this generation and this country are really lucky because so many important issues are being written about for children. So it's a luxury.
So this brings us to the end of the panel discussion today. And I thank you both for joining us. Thank you, Devika, and thank you, Paro, and thank you to Zai for being part of this discussion.